On that night, New York City still had a mayor, a police department, and a National Guard on standby. What it didn't have was control. Harlem was burning not because of chaos, but because years of pressure finally broke through the surface. Sirens were drowned out by voices. Badges no longer meant authority, and every option the city had left pointed toward one outcome: force. That's how governments respond when they lose legitimacy. They escalate. Orders were drafted. Units were mobilized. The Guard prepared to move into a neighborhood already wounded by anger and grief. Tanks and rifles were the language of the state, and Harlem had learned what that language usually meant. Once soldiers entered those streets, nothing would come back the same. And then something unexpected happened. Before the Guard could act, before curfews or mass arrests could be announced, one man stepped into the middle of the chaos without a uniform, without a badge, without legal authority. His name was Bumpy Johnson, and the people of Harlem listened to him in a way they no longer listened to City Hall. This story isn't about riots. It's about legitimacy, about the moment when official power realizes it can't command obedience, and unofficial power proves that it can. Bumpy didn't stop violence with threats. He didn't take sides between the crowd and the police. He did something far more dangerous to the system. He redirected the anger without letting it consume the neighborhood. What followed wasn't written in any emergency plan. A riot ended without a crackdown. The Guard arrived with nothing to suppress, and a single phone call forced the most powerful office in the city to respond to a man it officially pretended didn't exist. That night answered a question every city eventually faces. When institutions fail, who do people trust? Harlem answered clearly, and the consequences of that answer changed how power worked in the neighborhood for years to come. This is the story of the night the state prepared to crush Harlem and why it couldn't. Long before the streets filled with smoke, Harlem had been living under a quieter kind of siege. The war overseas was supposed to mean something sacrifice for freedom, uniforms earned through blood, citizenship proven on foreign soil. But at home, none of that translated into dignity. Black soldiers returned wearing medals and were met with the same suspicion, the same harassment, the same rules that told them where they could stand and how loudly they were allowed to speak. Harlem wasn't overrun with crime. It was overrun with neglect. Buildings were overcrowded, jobs were scarce, and police presence felt less like protection and more like occupation. Patrols didn't arrive to help. They arrived to assert control. Arrests came without explanations. Beatings came without consequences. Complaints disappeared into offices that never returned calls. This matters because unrest doesn't erupt in a vacuum. It accumulates. Every humiliation that goes unanswered becomes a weight. Every promise that leads nowhere adds pressure. By the early 1942, Harlem was carrying years of it. The neighborhood functioned, but it didn't breathe. That's why the flashpoint mattered less than what it revealed. When a uniformed soldier was harmed in public, the symbolism shattered whatever patience remained. He wasn't just a man. He was proof that service didn't protect you, that sacrifice didn't change your status. If even the uniform couldn't shield someone, then nothing would. The crowd that gathered wasn't organized. It was communal. Neighbors who recognized the same pattern in their own lives suddenly saw it laid bare, and once that recognition spreads, authority based on force alone begins to lose its grip. The city misread this moment. It saw disorder where there was actually grief. It saw criminality where there was exhaustion. And when institutions misunderstand the source of anger, their solutions tend to multiply the damage instead of containing it. Harlem wasn't demanding destruction. It was demanding acknowledgement. The problem was that the city had trained itself not to hear that language. And when listening fails, power defaults to suppression. That was the moment when the state prepared to escalate, and when the streets began to look for someone who understood what was really at stake. What turned tension into open defiance wasn't the scale of the response, it was the collapse of credibility. When authority relies on trust, it can absorb mistakes. When it relies only on force, a single visible injustice can undo years of control. In Harlem that night, the badge stopped meaning safety and started meaning threat. The city's response followed a familiar script. Statements were issued. Procedures were cited. The incident was framed as an exception, an unfortunate moment that would be handled internally. But the crowd had heard those words before, and nothing had changed. Each repetition hollowed them out further. By the time police lines tried to reassert order, they were speaking a language the street no longer believed. This is where power quietly shifts, not when people become violent, but when they stop expecting fairness. Once that expectation dies, compliance becomes optional. Commands turn into suggestions. Lines get tested, and the uniform, once a symbol of order, becomes just another target of anger. City Hall miscalculated the speed of that transition. Officials assumed authority could be restored by adding manpower, louder commands, and tougher posture. But authority doesn't scale that way. When legitimacy breaks, escalation accelerates, collapse. Every additional unit on the street confirmed what the crowd already felt. The city was preparing to control them, not protect them. Inside precincts and offices, the situation was being reduced to logistics. How many units? How many hours? How quickly reinforcements could arrive? Outside, Harlem was processing something entirely different, the realization that the system would rather manage unrest than address its cause. This gap mattered, because once the badge lost moral weight, someone else was going to fill that space, not with official power, but with recognition, with familiarity, with a voice that didn't need permission to be heard. That's the moment officials missed. They believed control could be reclaimed by force. They didn't see that the question had already changed. It was no longer who has authority. It was, who do people believe won't betray them next? And in Harlem, that answer was about to become very clear. From City Hall's perspective, the solution looked straightforward. When police lose control, you escalate. When escalation fails, you deploy overwhelming force. That logic has been used in cities around the world, and it always promises the same thing: order restored. What it rarely accounts for is what gets permanently damaged in the process. In Harlem, bringing in the National Guard wasn't a neutral decision. It carried history with it. Soldiers on neighborhood streets don't signal protection, they signal occupation. Curfews don't calm fear, they validate it. And once rifles and armored vehicles appear, every interaction becomes a potential flashpoint. One mistake, one panicked reaction, and the city would be counting bodies instead of broken windows. This is the calculation Bumpy Johnson understood immediately. Force might end the riot, but it would also end something else: the fragile line between anger and open war. Harlem wasn't facing a crime wave. It was facing a legitimacy crisis. Meeting that with troops would confirm the worst suspicion in the crowd, that the state only knew how to respond to black anger with violence. The mayor's advisors saw unrest as a fire to be extinguished. Bumpy saw it as pressure that needed release without collapse. Those are very different problems. Firefighting destroys what it saves if the structure is already weak. Pressure management keeps the structure standing. If the Guard moved in, the narrative would lock into place overnight. Harlem would become uncontrollable. The crackdown would be justified after the fact, and any future complaint, protest, or demand could be dismissed as a security risk. The short-term calm would come at the cost of long-term alienation. That's why stopping the Guard mattered more than stopping the riot itself. Once troops are deployed, there's no quiet way back. Someone has to win publicly. Someone has to lose. And in those confrontations, neighborhoods like Harlem never come out ahead. Bumpy understood that the only way to protect Harlem was to prevent the escalation before it became irreversible. Not by challenging the state head-on, but by making its most extreme option unnecessary. Because the most dangerous moment in any crisis isn't when people are angry, it's when the state decides it has nothing left to listen to. That was the moment he chose to step in. When anger reaches a certain temperature, commands stop working, orders bounce off, threats harden resistance. The only thing that still matters is who is speaking. In Harlem that night, the crowd wasn't looking for permission, they were looking for someone who understood them and wouldn't sell them out once the streets went quiet. That person was Bumpy Johnson. His authority didn't come from a title or a uniform. It came from memory, from years of being present when institutions were absent. When rent was due and no one listened, he stepped in. When businesses were shaken down, he stopped it. When families were pushed, he pushed back. Harlem didn't see him as perfect, they saw him as theirs. And in moments of crisis, ownership matters more than legality. This is the difference between power and legitimacy. Power can be imposed, legitimacy has to be granted. That night, the crowd didn't quiet down because they were afraid of consequences. They quieted down because they recognized the voice speaking to them as one that had never demanded sacrifice without sharing the cost. Bumpy didn't scold. He didn't lecture. He acknowledged the anger without validating the destruction. That balance is rare. Most figures choose a side. Either they defend the system and lose the people, or they inflame the crowd and lose control. Bumpy did neither. He reframed the moment. He made the destruction visible, not as rebellion, but as self-inflicted harm. He shifted the target of anger from buildings to accountability, from burning the neighborhood to protecting it, and because the crowd trusted his intentions, that reframing landed. What City Hall failed to understand was that legitimacy is local. It's built in kitchens, on stoops, in back rooms and small favors remembered years later. You can't deploy it with a convoy, you can't announce it at a press conference, and you can't replace it once it's gone. That night proved something uncomfortable for the state. Authority doesn't belong exclusively to institutions. When those institutions lose credibility, someone else will occupy the space. Not with force, but with consent. Harlem listened to Bumpy Johnson because he had never treated the neighborhood as a problem to be managed. He treated it as a community to be protected. And in a moment when everything could have collapsed, that distinction stopped the streets faster than any order ever could. Stopping violence is easy if you're willing to pick a side and crush the other. Stopping violence without validating either side's worst instincts is far harder. That was the line Bumpy Johnson walked that night. And it's why the streets actually listened. He didn't defend the police. He didn't excuse what had triggered the anger. Doing so would have ended the conversation instantly. At the same time, he refused to glorify destruction. Burning Harlem didn't punish City Hall, it punished the people who lived there. By naming that truth out loud, he redirected rage away from spectacle and toward purpose. This mattered because riots collapse when their logic is exposed. Once people see that their actions are producing the opposite of what they want, momentum breaks. Bumpy's intervention wasn't about calming emotions, it was about changing incentives. He made it clear that continued chaos would hand the state exactly what it wanted: justification to roll in force and redefine Harlem as a security problem, instead of a community with grievances. At the same time, he offered an alternative that felt credible, not a promise that things would be investigated, but a guarantee that someone who understood both the street and the system would carry the demand forward. That assurance created a pause, and in mass unrest, pauses are everything. They're the moment when people decide whether to escalate or disengage. Crucially, Bumpy didn't ask for trust, he spent it. Years of protection, mediation, and follow-through were cashed in at once. That's why the call to stand down worked. It wasn't a request, it was a reminder of a relationship that had already been proven. By refusing to take the state's side, he preserved his legitimacy. By refusing to take the crowd's most destructive impulse, he preserved the neighborhood. The balance was delicate, and it couldn't have been held by someone who needed permission to act. As the streets quieted, the meaning became clear. Order had returned without surrender. The city's most extreme option, the Guard, had been made unnecessary, and for the first time that night, control didn't come from force or fear. It came from consent. That set the stage for what happened next, because once the riot ended without a crackdown, the power to define the outcome shifted to the person who stopped it. That night ended without tanks in the streets, without mass arrests, and without Harlem being rewritten as a crime scene. Not because the state showed restraint, but because someone outside the state proved restraint was still possible. Bumpy Johnson didn't stop the Guard with authority. He stopped it by making authority unnecessary. The lesson City Hall learned was uncomfortable. Badges and uniforms can impose order, but they can't manufacture trust. When institutions lose credibility, escalation doesn't restore control, it exposes the gap. Harlem didn't calm down because it feared consequences. It calmed down because it believed someone was finally willing to protect it without asking it to submit. That phone call mattered because it reversed the usual direction of power. Instead of the state dictating terms to the streets through Bumpy set conditions for peace. Accountability instead of occupation. Reform instead of repression. The mayor didn't respond out of respect for a gangster. He responded because the alternative was admitting that force was his only language left. History often frames moments like this as anomalies. They aren't. They're warnings. They show what happens when legitimacy erodes and someone else steps in to fill the space. Not with laws, but with relationships. Not with weapons, but with credibility earned over time. Bumpy Johnson didn't claim to be a hero. He claimed responsibility. And in that moment, responsibility mattered more than rank. Harlem didn't need saving. It needed someone who would refuse to let it be crushed in its own name. When the smoke cleared, the city still had its Guard. It still had its police. What it didn't have was the illusion that power flows in only one direction. That night proved something lasting. When people trust one voice more than an institution, the balance has already shifted. Harlem remembered that, and so did City Hall.